The America's Democrats podcast, a project of 21st Century Democrats, is made possible by contributions from our listeners. Want to do more? Go to americasdemocrats.org and click Donate. And thank you for allowing us to be your voice. And if you enjoy the show, please share it with your friends on Facebook and Twitter, and leave us a review on your favorite podcast app. This is the America's Democrats podcast, the weekly podcast for stand-up Democrats. I'm your host, Jim Cuddy. This week, author Jenny Price on getting environmentalism right before it's too late. Activist Wallace Mazon on why the Sunrise Movement is fighting for good jobs. Plus, Bill Press with journalist Susan Page on her new book, Madam Speaker, Nancy Pelosi and the Lessons of Power. Had enough of Fox News, the House Freedom Caucus, and Donald Trump? If you want the facts that you won't get from them or from the fake news sites of the alt-right, then stay tuned. Our sponsor, 21st Century Democrats, works hard to get everyday Democrats involved in returning our party to its roots and to success at the ballot box. Sit back and listen, then stand up and fight. And follow 21st Century Democrats on Facebook for all the latest progressive news. We're glad you can join us. In her new book, author Jenny Price writes about how environmentalists view and talk about their movement. And all too often, she writes, they become part of the problem. And we say hello to Jenny Price, public writer, artist, and historian focusing on U.S. environmental topics. She's also the author, most recently, of Stop Saving the Planet, an Environmentalist Manifesto. Jenny Price, thank you so much for joining us today on the America's Democrats podcast.
Thanks so much. Great to be here.
And great to have you with us. I have to say, when I first saw the title of the book, it gave me some pause. But you've written what can be fairly be described as a provocative new book on the environmental movement. How do you describe the saving the planet approach to environmentalism, and what are its limitations?
Great. So I'll just back up a little bit and start with the premise of the book is that our solutions are not working, right? We're 30 years behind on climate change. We're eating and drinking plastics. We have a sixth extinction. We could go on and on and on. And so when I say stop saving the planet, what I mean is that we need to stop thinking of the central question of environmentalism, if you're worried about climate change, as being how to save the environment, as something that's out there, right, as a not human world, and really start talking about how we change environments to live, that our lives are foundationally environmental. If you look around you in your studio, everything you see is made out of environment, from your clothes to the microphone to the walls. And the two most important questions you can possibly ask if you're flipping out about climate change, and if you want to save anything at all, isn't how do we save the environment? It's how do we change environments to create our stuff, and how do we change environments to create our wealth? And the answer, obviously, is horribly, egregiously badly, right? We have incredibly toxic industrial practices, by and large, and we change environments to create wealth by maximizing profits and growth instead of health and well-being. And I think that when I say stop saving the planet, that actually most of the popular common environmentalist strategies for decades now have failed to seriously grapple with how we change environments to live and with our industrial and economic practices. And they just allow us basically to believe that we're doing something, but it's 2021 and we're out of time and we have to stop pretending.
Mm-hmm. Well, and given its limitations, what's the appeal of this approach? Why are people attracted to it?
That's a really good question. It's really, really powerful. And a lot of my book, it really is about why it's so powerful. And I should say that a lot of people who are saving the planet have very good intentions, and they're scared and they want to do something. But I think when it really boils down to is that saving the planet, thinking about environmentalism as saving the planet, works best for if you're affluent, right? So it's the affluent folks who change environments, who contribute the most to how we change environments to create our stuff and wealth badly. They benefit the most from how we do that. And they suffer the fewest consequences because we're not stashing the toxics by and large in their neighborhoods, right? So I think save the planet, I call it have your Prius and drive it to environmentalism, or the convenient truth of environmentalism is that you get to save the planet and be heroic, right? And believe that you're actually doing something about, say, the climate crisis, but you don't actually have to challenge the causes of the crisis, which are these incredibly unsustainable and inequitable industrial and economic practices.
Is it just individuals that are driving the saving the planet approach, or are corporations and lawmakers as well? And if so, how do they participate?
Yeah, I think that saying that individuals are driving the climate crisis is about the same as saying that individuals can solve the crises, which I think has been a hallmark of environmentalism since the first Earth Day in 1970, that somehow, individuals can, personally solve the climate crisis from your kitchen. No, I think the responsibility is mostly for corporations and for the public policies that actually encourage and subsidize horrible corporate behavior. So you have, say, the plastics crisis, and Coke would like you to believe that that's a consumer waste problem, but the fact is that they've spent now over 50 years fighting legislation to ban the production of single-use plastics, which is actually the problem. The problem is actually like a producing toxic crap problem, not a consumer waste problem, right? And they have managed to shape public policies in ways that encourage them to continue to produce plastic pollution.
So they almost make themselves look like the hero, the corporations, and let the little person clean up their little bit of plastic, and it seems like, oh gosh, everyone's doing the right thing, and that's far from reality.
Oh, recycling is one of the biggest scams, environmentally speaking, that you could possibly. It's been going on for so long. I mean, they've known since the 1950s that plastics were going to be extremely difficult to recycle. And since then, we have recycled a grand total of about 9% of the plastics out there. We're now producing 350 million tons a year. That's supposed to go up to, I think, 2 billion tons or 1 billion tons by 2050. There will be more plastics than fish in the ocean. So they've been enormously successful. And every time there's a pushback, the plastic and fossil fuel companies create another, the latest one, I think it was in 2019, when China decided they weren't going to take our plastics anymore. And so there was this recycling crisis, is now called Alliance to End Plastic Waste, which is just a complete scam.
Yeah. Now, as you say, instead of changing the planet, you want people to think about changing the environment. Before we talk about concrete actions that could be involved there, how is the approach different in its view of how change happens?
Well, I guess actually I don't so much talk about saving. I think that Americans tend to use the planet and the environment as pretty much synonyms. We talk about, like, when you think about, people and the planet, that's a really common phrase. So I think that just means people and the environment. But I think, again, in terms of change happening, I think, it has to happen fast. We're out of time. We're decades behind on trying to solve most of these issues. It has to happen at the level of public policy. And we have to finally at last address the root causes, which is primarily an economy that is inherently hardwired to ignore social and environmental costs. Because what we've been doing is we've been trying to address environmental crises, sort of crisis by crisis, pollutant by pollutant. So we did something about acid rain, but now we still have climate change and sort of massive toxic landfills. And all over the country, we have 1,340 Superfund sites. So I think, we have these two fantasies about how change happens. We think we can have technological solutions, right? Which is absurd. And obviously we need technology, but that's not going to solve the problem because it's not actually addressing the causes. And then I think we have these solutions that use the problem to solve the problem, and particularly trying to use an economy that maximizes growth and profits to try to solve it. So you have, we think that replacing jillions of cars with jillions of electric brand new cars is somehow going to solve the problem. No, that just basically fuels our consumerist economy. We think that carbon trading, which I call the most terrifying sidestep the problem solution because of the scale of it, is somehow going to solve the problem. And it's just, carbon trading is just dumping billions of dollars into an economy that's hardwired to perpetuate climate change, essentially. So I think, how does change happen? Stop doing it problem by problem and actually finally at last address the root causes. Don't think that technology is going to save us, and stop trying to use the problem to solve the problem.
Mm-hmm. We're speaking to Jenny Price, public writer, artist, and historian focusing on U.S. environmental topics, also the author most recently of Stop Saving the Planet, an Environmentalist Manifesto. Jenny, moving to more concrete actions, the book does include ideas on what people can do to start changing the environment. In terms of what fits under a heading of environmental activism, what would you say are a few suggestions?
So this is the question that I get the most often, right? It's like, what can I do? What can I do? And the first thing I say is stop being so obsessed with the question, what can I do? Because the obsession with the question, what can I do, is a part of the problem, right? It's that, is that so much of what we have now is basically feel-good environmentalism, and it's designed a lot more to make people feel good than it is to actually do anything. So what can you do? I have a bunch of, so the book's divided into 11 reasons to stop saving the planet, which is sort of the stuff we've already been talking about, the critique. And then there are 39 ways to stop saving the planet at the end. So what are those 39 ways? Well, for one thing, focus on the worst, where the worst messes are. Making your house cleaner in Beverly Hills isn't going to do a single thing to help any environmental problem, except making your house cleaner in Beverly Hills, which is probably worth it, but don't think that you're actually solving problems. Where are the worst messes in Los Angeles? They're in Southeast LA, which is one of the most polluted places in the country. They're in East LA. They're in the low-income communities, and they're in communities of color. So can you go and help those people who are trying to tackle those messes actually clean them up? And then I have a lot of suggestions to the degree that I kind of go along with individual action. I suggest focusing on two things, and one is your consumer habits. Stop buying so much, for God's sake, and stop thinking that that's going to actually save the planet. And then also, probably most important, is to think about how you create wealth. How do you personally change environments to create wealth? I think that's the most important thing you can do, far more important than how you actually give your wealth away or spend your wealth after the fact. So I suggest that. And then I have a whole bunch of suggestions that are really just about changing how we think. I'm a cultural critic. That's really ultimately what the book is about. So it's also like, be knowledgeable. I have a whole bunch of suggestions for things you can read and look at, but also like redefine environment, redefine economy, redefine ambitious, redefine GDP and costs and efficiency. I think we have to really kind of massively rethink how we understand even what an economy is, what environment is, and how they're connected to each other.
Going back to paying attention to how we create wealth, why? Well, I understand why it's so important, as you just sort of laid that out. What does that look like in practice? Because we've known one way and only one way for our lifetime, and now we've got to redo everything. How does that work?
So, there's probably a lot of people out there who could explain that, much better than I'm not an economist, but I think, the solutions are kind of obvious. People say, oh my God, but we'd have to, we don't have the solutions. It requires major change. And really the solutions are all out there. People have been talking about how to create an equitable economy that doesn't require growth and that maximizes people's ability to thrive rather than profits for decades and decades and decades. So it's not like the solutions aren't out there, but I think that, we have to stop. I think one of the main things we have to do in the realm of how to think differently is stop, like you said, it's all we know. Stop assuming that our economy is normal. Our economy is insane. It is radical. It is extreme. I'm not the radical. I think when you have an economy in which you actually have to basically, if you're trying to incorporate your business, you actually have to apply basically for an exemption. It's a whole separate category if you want to maximize anything except profits. That's insane. That's pathological. That's an economy that's just pathological. It's not normal when Jeff Bezos has $270 billion and most of the people in this country are struggling to get by, and his employees have horrible jobs, that they could lose at any moment. His business plan is filling up our landfills and clogging our streets and destroying our local businesses and the sources of our local wealth. This is not normal. And I think we have to stop talking about the kinds of things that I and so many other people are talking about as radical change and as common sense.
Mm-hmm. So when I order my fragrant-free detergent from Amazon, I'm not helping the environment at all. In fact, I'm adding to the problem.
Amazon, is not my favorite company, and they're increasingly becoming a huge part of the problem. And for me, the question is, in one of the 39 ways, I say, well, think bigger, think bigger. So when you say that, Amazon is convenient, right? First of all,
Sure.
Think about the cost of Amazon, like that. it's cheaper for you, but ultimately it costs everyone a little bit more if you factor in all the social and environmental costs, if you factor in all the people who are, on public assistance who actually work for Amazon, if you factor in all the environmental costs. The costs are huge actually to shop at Amazon. But also, why is it so important to get your toilet paper the next day? Well, okay, with toilet paper, that might be important, but, why doesn't anybody have time? And those are much bigger questions. Those are the essential questions. It's like, why don't we have time to do anything that sustains our lives except, do these often very unsatisfying jobs for 12 hours a day, and maybe you have 3 of them? The questions are much bigger. Why do people work so much? Why don't they have enough money? So they have to work so much. So it's like, we have to completely redefine how we think about costs, how we think about what the causes of problems are. Mm-hmm. I mean, nobody needs to shop at Amazon, honestly. It's what we had that week or something where it was like, oh, wow, I'm not going to shop at Amazon for a week in order to support the strikers in Alabama. And you're like, it's just not that hard. That makes it sound like it's so difficult not to shop on Amazon, but it's actually incredibly easy not to shop on Amazon.
Given that, I happen to live in a fairly well-populated area, and there's a grocery store every mile, and anything else I could possibly want, I don't need to shop at Amazon. Yet I'm guilty of shopping at Amazon. So lesson learned here. Before we let you go, there is one suggestion that may be surprising to some, and that is to have a sense of humor. How does humor help?
That's a question that's very close to my heart. And actually, the way I put it it's one of the 39 ways is tell a frickin' joke, right? Because first of all, environmentalists are just so. Actually, 3 of my 11 reasons to stop saving the planet are because everyone hates environmentalists. And one of the reasons they hate environmentalists is because I don't think we're actually helping a lot of people. But the other is that we're so humorless, right? And irony is important for, a couple of reasons. Obviously, that I think we need to emulate, John Oliver and Jon Stewart, right? Like using humor for good, right? It's that life is ironic. And if you can't appreciate that, that people think in complex ways, and they might hate environmentalists, but love environmental policies, right? Or, if you can't appreciate that a Prius can be a good strategy, but also a really bad strategy in many ways, right? And we have to understand, we have to be able to laugh at ourselves and be ironic, but also humor obviously is a great way these are very, very contentious issues. And it's just a great way to disarm people. I think that, when you see like political protests, I think instead of shaking your fists and say, what do we want? When do we want it? You should be holding a dance party in response to the white supremacists, with the playlist. You could have a lot of fun coming up with that playlist while they march through town. One of my favorite examples, which is not environmental, that I use in my book is there was a annual Nazi parade that went through this town in Germany. And so the people in this town in Germany created a Nazi walkathon where for every step that the parade took, they basically donated money to anti-white supremacist causes. I think that's how you actually make effective change, because then that also really appealed to a lot of people who might otherwise not have really paid attention or cared. So I think humor, look, I'm a smart ass. I was born that way. I have 3 older brothers. I'm from a very funny family. So I've always just not avoided humor in my work. But I also think that it is seriously a very important thing to
I agree with you 100%. In fact, humor heals a lot of things, and we need a lot more of it. And the name of the book is Stop Saving the Planet, an Environmentalist Manifesto. The author, Jenny Price, public writer, artist, and historian focusing on U.S. environmental topics, joining us today on the America's Democrats podcast. Jenny, appreciate your time. Would love to have you back again soon.
Thank you so much. I'd love to come back.
Great. Thank you. And this is the America's Democrats podcast, the weekly podcast for stand-up Democrats. We want you to sit back and listen to this americasdemocrats.org podcast, a project of 21st Century Democrats. But we need you to stand up and fight. Do you want to get involved and help get our party back to its roots and to success at the ballot box? You can make your contribution to help us keep this show going and to elect Democrats who will stand up for democratic principles. Go to americasdemocrats.org and click on Donate at the top of the page.
This Social Security measure, I believe that we must pass legislation to provide medical care.
This is our tradition. When our grandparents came to America, it was the Democratic Party which said, welcome. It was the Democratic Party, the party of Roosevelt and Truman and Kennedy and others, who said that America belonged to all its people, not just a handful of the rich or a few giant corporations. That's why great leaders like FDR fought so hard for Social Security, and why JFK stood up to the insurance companies and their Republican allies to get Medicare. It's not just one thing, or one time, in one place. It's about a whole history of standing up to the Republicans and saying someone has to be on the side of regular working people in America, whether it's defending Social Security or just the way your loved ones are treated on the job. That's what the Democratic Party is all about. And that's why this message has been brought to you by the Democratic Party. Working people like you and me.
Paid for by 21st Century Democrats. Not authorized by any candidate or candidates committee. This is the America's Democrats Podcast, the weekly podcast for stand-up Democrats. Coming up next, why the Sunrise Movement is fighting for good jobs. But first, we turn to Jim Hightower, America's #1 populist, for his common sense commentary.
Is corporate ethics an oxymoron? Do you have to be a jerk to be a successful CEO? Is exploitation the only path to profit? The good news is that many companies, big and small, in the food economy are blazing a different path through Wall Street's jungle of greed, demonstrating that money and morality can be compatible. Texas supermarket chain H-E-B, for example, has drawn an intense loyal customer base by 1. Investing in good wages and benefits for employees, 2. Showing up in such emergencies as pandemics, hurricanes, freezes to give essential supplies and hands-on help, and 3. Being an involved and supportive neighbor to the hundreds of unique communities it serves. Also, Maine Grains is relocalizing the business of milling grain by working with local farmers who had been abandoned by global grain marketers. They're producing flours from heritage grains, boosting the local economy in the process. Then there's Bob's Red Mill, which also mills its products from diverse natural grains, and it's 100% employee-owned. These are part of a rising business alternative to the selfish profiteering ethic of Fortune 500 titans. Called certified B corporations, they definitely exist to make a profit, but they're equally focused on having a positive social impact, prioritizing fair wages, environmental protections, and healthy communities as core elements of their missions, even making those goals legal requirements of their corporate charter. This is Jim Hightower saying Ben & Jerry's and New Belgium Brewery are just a couple more of some 3,800 other businesses now organized as B Corps. Though not pretending to be perfect, they're at least striving to be more than money grubbers, instead trying to contribute to the common good. For more information, go to bcorporation.net. The Hightower Radio Lowdown is brought to you by the Lowdown Happy Hour, now live streaming on Facebook from the Chat and Chew Cafe. So grab a libation, pull up a virtual chair, and join our freewheeling conversations with political mavericks, musical agitators, and kick-ass grassroots groups. The Lowdown Happy Hour will connect you to good trouble activists who are building people power across America. Get the lowdown at hightowerlowdown.org.
This is the America's Democrats Podcast, the weekly podcast for stand-up Democrats. With the nation facing an economic crisis and a climate crisis at the same time, the Sunrise Movement has launched a new campaign to tackle both. Activist Wallace Mazon says the fight for good jobs has to go hand in hand with the fight against climate change. And we say hello to Wallace Mazon, advocacy lead with the Sunrise Movement. Wallace, thanks for joining us today on the America's Democrats Podcast.
Thanks for having me.
Absolutely, our pleasure. So the Sunrise Movement recently launched a Good Jobs for All campaign. Why did you launch the campaign and why now?
Yeah, that's a good question. So if you don't know much about Sunrise, your listeners, Sunrise Movement is a youth movement working to stop climate change. We really believe that We need a Green New Deal to fight the climate crisis and put millions of people to work doing so. And that's why we launched the Good Jobs for All campaign. There are millions of Americans who are unemployed or underemployed, and our leaders have no plan to put people back to work as we slowly recover from COVID-19. And on top of that, the climate is rapidly changing around us, and we need people with good jobs to revolutionize our infrastructure and protect our cities and communities from climate devastation, as we saw this winter in Texas. That's the key example of how we are not prepared for the realities of climate change on our communities and infrastructure.
Yeah, Texas is a great example of how ugly it can get. Not to mention the oceans rising and everything else that's going on, temperature of the earth rising. And as you mentioned, the campaign focuses on the Green New Deal as a way to create good jobs. But what does good jobs mean within the context of this campaign?
Right. So, the jobs that we're talking about would be, more traditional climate jobs, but also includes jobs that help communities become more resilient, right? Also, jobs that are more on the care economy side of things, right? And these jobs would include good salaries and benefits, livable wages with full healthcare coverage, housing, healthcare, long-term career opportunities.
So in terms, let's talk about some of the specific policies that need to be part of the Green New Deal if it is, in fact, to respond to the concerns of this campaign.
Right. So that's a good question. So specifically, there are three things on the top of my mind that would be good to support. One, Representative Ayanna Pressley actually introduced a federal jobs guarantee resolution in the House. So that's a really important thing. Obviously, that's part of the Green New Deal, federal jobs guarantee. So we would like our elected officials to support that. Two, the $2 trillion infrastructure plan that Biden introduced to the American public and spoke about during his joint address. A lot of it, if you heard it, he was talking about good jobs, using a lot of Sunrise's talking points about how we need to put people to work, fighting the climate crisis with good paying jobs. And some of the proposal in Biden's plan is, some's good, some's not as ambitious as we would like it to be, right? We don't think that $2 trillion is enough money to actually tackle the climate crisis at the scale. But at speed, this money is going out, between 8 and 10 years. People really need the money. We need to get that money out as fast as we can. What Sunrise wants is the Thrive Agenda, which calls for $10 trillion over the next decade. So $1 trillion each year fighting the climate crisis. And the third thing is the Civilian Climate Corps, which was wrote into executive action by the Biden administration during his first week. And AOC and Senator Ed Markey actually introduced a version of the Civilian Climate Corps. And this would put 1.5 million people to work fighting the climate crisis with the things I was telling you about, good salary and benefits, $15 an hour, right? Good union paying jobs, putting people to work fighting climate change. And we see this as the blueprint to the Green New Deal, right? The infrastructure package is the blueprint to the Green New Deal. And we see the CCC, the Civilian Climate Corps, as a blueprint to a federal jobs guarantee.
We're speaking to Wallace Mazon, advocacy lead with the Sunrise Movement. Now, you mentioned a couple, Ed Markey and AOC. In terms of strategy, though, who are some of your other existing allies in Congress?
Well, Bernie Sanders, a strong ally, the Squad, obviously, right. And there's so many. Cori Bush just introduced the Green New Deal for cities with AOC in the House. Right. So we see so many new ideas coming from Congress now since the Green New Deal has been introduced. But Sunrise has the saying, no permanent friends, no permanent enemies, right? So we're willing to work with anyone who, is willing to, do what's right for their constituents and do what's right for our futures.
How daunting a task is that for you, though? Because there's been so much pushback from the right about, Green New Deal isn't, it's spending way too much money. And it's not. It's an investment in our future, of course. But how do you balance that?
Sometimes you just tell the truth. I mean, right? We see what science is saying. We even see some Republicans saying that like climate change is real. So, what are we going to do? Are we going to continue to not act? Are we going to continue to see our communities burn? We're going to continue to see our infrastructure fail? Or are we going to step up to the plate and we're going to actually invest in our communities? Like you said, this is an investment in people, right? This is an investment in our communities and our cities. So if, the Republicans always talk about bipartisanship, but fighting for our communities, fighting for our children, that's bipartisan. And if they want to work with us, we're willing to do that.
What about labor unions, Wally? Are they working with you on this campaign?
Yeah, so CWI and IUPAT are original pledge signers to the Good Jobs for All campaign. And we also work with the Green New Deal Network, which SEIU is a part of. So, they know what we have to face and they want to be a part of the solution. And also, Sunrise is a big supporter of the PRO Act, which would make it easier for people to unionize. And, I'm from Florida, which is a right to work state. And the state government has done a great job of making it so difficult for people to unionize and fight for livable wages. And if you saw in the news a couple of days ago, the coal miners in West Virginia wanted to be a part of a just transition because they see the problems of climate change and they want to be a part of solutions.
And it's something. So you brought up coal miners, and there's such an obvious transition where programs can be developed that will train people that are in one particular field, coal, and so that they can learn another type of energy related service. It could be solar, it could be water, wind energy, anything. I mean, it's not a loss of jobs, it's just recreating jobs, right?
Yeah, exactly. And, I don't know too much about, coal miners, but I do know about good wages and I do know about good jobs. And, people know about science and they see what climate change is doing to their community. So I'm really happy that, they decided to, want to be a part of these conversations, because when we talk about a just transition, it can't be just if they're not a part of the conversation, right? So hopefully, we can have those conversations and we can make this truly a just transition.
Obviously, more members of Congress need to be won over, and you're asking the public to send a pledge to the representatives. What are some of the specific elements of the pledge, and what kind of response have you seen since you launched the campaign back in early March?
Right. So we're asking our representatives to support Good Jobs for All, just saying that, they'll support legislation like the CCC that will put people to work fighting climate change, and just a little step towards our goal of a federal jobs guarantee, which is a step to the Green New Deal. And since we launched, we've seen positive reviews from certain members of Congress. They've signed on. There hasn't been any arm twisting or anything like that, because they believe in the stuff that we're doing. And, some members of Congress we have had to have some difficult conversations with, but that's what democracy is, right? We have to continue to do the work. We have to continue to ask our elected officials to do what their constituents want, because it's what the community needs.
Absolutely. Now, as you mentioned, the Sunrise Movement is a youth-led political movement. Do you feel that young Americans overall, the vast majority of young Americans, are they ready to focus their energy on a jobs program?
I think so. What we've been seeing, out in the world is that, like, one, people are coming out of college with a lot of student debt, right? Two, people are coming out of college with degrees and they have jobs that, they don't find fulfilling. And another thing is that, they might be coming out of college, with an underpaying job. And these are people just in college. We're not even talking about people who, decided to do a trade or something like that, So I think people are really focused on jobs. People want meaningful work that will, provide for their families. I think that's one of the most important things. So I think that, young people especially, are focused on that. And they're definitely focused on climate change because, if we don't get a handle on that, it's game over for all of us. So why not have a good paying job fighting climate change?
Absolutely. Wallace Mazon, advocacy lead with the Sunrise Movement. If you want to learn more about them, by the way, you can check them out at sunrisemovement.org. Wally, appreciate your time with us today and wish you the best of luck and would love to hear how you're doing down the road sometime.
Thank you. It was my pleasure.
Thank you. And this is the America's Democrats podcast, the weekly podcast for stand-up Democrats. We want you to sit back and listen, but we need you to stand up and fight. Help get our party back to its roots and to success at the ballot box. Make your contribution to keep the americasdemocrats.org podcast, a project of 21st Century Democrats, on the air, and help elect stand-up Democrats. Go to americasdemocrats.org and click on Donate at the top of the page. This is the America's Democrats podcast, the weekly podcast for stand-up Democrats. And now Bill Press with journalist and author Susan Page on her new political biography about our nation's first female Speaker of the House.
John Boehner says that Nancy Pelosi is maybe the most powerful speaker ever. Do you agree? And isn't it unusual for a former speaker to say that about the current speaker?
Well, it's unusual for a former Republican speaker to say that about a current Democratic speaker.
Good point.
But Boehner, in his book, which is just out, is pretty critical of Republican speakers, of Kevin McCarthy, maybe not so much, Paul Ryan, some, of speakers, of Newt Gingrich, definitely. But for Nancy Pelosi, while he didn't always agree with her, I think he saw her as someone who could look at a goal and get there in a way that is he respects, since he himself has been in that position. He said that she's the most powerful speaker of his lifetime, and maybe in American history. I think it's hard to look back into previous centuries and make a smart judgment about that, but I think it is pretty clear that she is the most consequential speaker since Sam Rayburn, the most consequential speaker in modern times.
So, having talked to the speaker and having talked to so many people who have worked with her and maybe some against her, Susan, what did you find that makes Nancy Pelosi so effective?
Nancy Pelosi knows how to get power. She's been the leader of the House Democrats since 2003. She knows how to hold on to power over a long period of time through some ups and downs, through being in the majority and the minority. And she knows how to wield power. She knows how to see a goal, figure out what she can do to convince other members of Congress to vote her way to get to that goal. And she's done that in a way that is a case study in effective legislative leadership.
You often cite the phrase iron fist and a Gucci glove. That kind of sums her up, right?
This is actually a John Bresnahan phrase from a profile he did for Politico more than a decade ago. And when I read that, when I was looking through clips, I thought that is exactly right, because she does have a Gucci glove. She does have soft power and ability to use it. But if she needs it, she takes out that iron fist and she'll deploy that as well.
Right. And she has something else, I think, that you cite also, Susan, which is a long memory, right? As, for example, in the case of Jane Harman. You want to tell us about that?
So Jane Harman, a fellow member of Congress, Democratic member of Congress from California, had been the ranking Democrat on the House Intelligence Committee. When Democrats won the majority, she wanted to be the chair. That didn't happen. Nancy Pelosi prevented that from happening. And this is Jane Harman never forgot this. She complained that Nancy Pelosi was settling some kind of personal score. Now, I don't know if Pelosi was settling a personal score or not, but I know that every Democratic member of Congress knows this story, and it has probably meant that some of them have been careful not to get on her wrong side.
Right. And the issue was that Jane Harman had voted for Steny Hoyer, I guess for whip or for leader, not Nancy Pelosi. Nancy knew that. And again, long memory. I have to tell you, Susan, I had the same experience myself with another former member from California, very prominent, part of the Democratic leadership at one time. And I suggested, I forget what event we were planning, but that this former member, be invited. And I was told flatly, no, he voted for Steny.
Pretty remarkable. The rivalry with Steny Hoyer, I think they have a better relationship now than they had in the past, but that rivalry goes back to the earliest days when Steny Hoyer thought he was in line to become the Democratic whip, and Nancy Pelosi ran what amounted to an insurgent campaign against him. At least that's what he saw it as, and she won. And she has been one step ahead of him ever since then. Harry Reid, the former Senate Democratic leader, told me a story too, that he had gone to Pelosi on behalf of a Democratic member of the House from his home state of Nevada. I always get that wrong. Nevada, I think. And he said, "Can you please put her on this committee she wants to be on?" And Pelosi said no. And Reid was quite surprised because, he's the leader of the Senate Democrats. He's asking this little favor. Why wouldn't you do it? And Pelosi said to him, she voted for Steny.
Mm-hmm.
And Harry Reid told me it took him 3 Congresses to get this member of Congress on the committee she wanted.
I was also impressed that Jack Murtha, at one point, who was very close to Nancy as part of the leadership, described her as playing the long game and sharing the credit. I mean, I have always found that is something that strikes me about Nancy Pelosi. I've been to so many events with her, and at every event, she begins by recognizing every single member of the House who's in that room by name, right? And saying something good about every one of them.
And don't you know that every single Democratic member of the House in that room remembers that she bothered to recognize them? That is political gold. Jack Murtha is such an important figure in Nancy Pelosi's rise because he had been, he's this Marine veteran from coal country in Pennsylvania, and he turns out to chair her campaign for the leadership against Steny Hoyer. A shock, I think, to Steny Hoyer when that was announced. And for the book I hired a researcher in Pittsburgh to go through Jack Murtha's papers, which are at the University of Pittsburgh. And she found these handwritten notes that Murtha had kept for a memoir he was going to write that he never wrote, in which he talked about how much respect he had for Pelosi, how some of the old guys didn't like her or didn't think a woman should be in the leadership, but how he found her to be one of the best political minds he had ever met.
Right. So where did Nancy learn her politics? San Francisco?
No, as you know, what a setup that was. She learned her politics in Baltimore. Her father was this larger-than-life 3-term mayor of Baltimore, known to everyone as Tommy the Elder. And, she also learned it from her remarkable mother, who was known as Big Nancy D'Alessandro. Big Nancy was the political organizer for her husband. She was an operative in her own right. She was an entrepreneur. She was really quite a remarkable figure. She was restless and ambitious. And she had 6 sons and finally a daughter, little Nancy. They named the daughter after her, and her focus in some ways, and there are so many ways in which Nancy Pelosi reflects the lessons she learned from Big Nancy D'Alessandro.
Well, one is the favor file, right? Tell us about the favor file.
It's so the Big Nancy, when she was working for her husband, who served elected 5 times to Congress, 3 times as mayor, would keep what she called a favor file, and she would sit in the front hall of their house in Little Italy, and there people would line up with favors to ask. Sometimes they'd be lined up out the door, and they would come in and sit down in front of her with whatever favor they needed. Maybe they had a son who needed to get out of jail, or maybe they were homeless and they needed to get some public housing, or maybe they were hungry, or maybe they had an immigration status problem. And Big Nancy would write down what they needed, often help them figure out how to solve whatever problem they were facing, and keep a record of it. And then down the road, they might be relied on to provide a favor for the next person who needed it. If they were in a position to be helpful to someone else down the line who needed a favor. And you could certainly count on them to vote
Right.
for Tommy the Elder.
Right. And that's certainly a lesson that Nancy has applied to her own political career in terms of keeping track again of who did good things for her and whom she owes favors to, or vice versa. And yet, as you point out early on in the book, Susan, Nancy Pelosi, for all of her skills and all of her achievements, I'll talk about those in a second, is, as you point out, quote, regularly demonized and routinely underestimated. To their peril, I would say, people who do that, right?
Well, now, of course, Republicans have loved Nancy Pelosi in some ways because she's been a great fundraising foil. They depict her as an out of the mainstream San Francisco liberal. She has united Democrats in her time. She's also done something to unite Republicans because they have used her against the Democratic Party generally. But I also think that at least until the era of Donald Trump, Nancy Pelosi did not get her due as for her skills as a political leader. And there may be a couple reasons for that. You mentioned how she tended to give credit to other people. I think that was part of it. I think sexism was part of it as well. It's when Donald Trump got elected and Nancy Pelosi put aside her plans to retire that she became the face of the Democratic opposition and an enormously effective face against Donald Trump, and someone who managed over and over again to get under his skin.
What do you consider Nancy's biggest legislative achievements?
Well, you ask her, and she would say the Affordable Care Act, the biggest expansion in healthcare since Medicare and Medicaid. There was a time when Democrats lost their 60th vote in the Senate, when they lost the Kennedy seat in Massachusetts to Scott Brown, just about everybody in town thought there was no way to pass this big healthcare bill. And one of the few people who thought it was still possible was Nancy Pelosi.
There were even people in the White House, right, who thought it was impossible.
Well, like the chief of staff, Rahm Emanuel,
right.
was arguing, we can't do something big, let's do something small. She made that impossible. She had this extraordinary meeting in the White House a few days after Scott Brown had won that special election, in which she said, we're going to go big. Some people want to go small. You can choose to go small, but if you do that, you'll do that without me. I will not push a small bill through the House. What an extraordinary threat to the President of the United States. She basically said, you can get nothing, or we can go big, which is what I want to do. And of course, that is what Barack Obama chose to do.
Right. Particularly significant for her to say that to a president of her own party. Right.
And one she revered in many ways and honored. But, Nancy Pelosi is not afraid of presidents. She's not afraid of presidents with whom she's allied, like Barack Obama, and she's not afraid of presidents she is against, like Donald Trump.
If there's one legitimate criticism you mentioned, but one that we hear a lot, is that it's the inside-outside game difference with Nancy. Good at one and not so great at the other. Is that a fair criticism?
Not so great is a kind way to put it, because Nancy Pelosi, I think, is the most skilled political operative inside that we have on the public scene today. Historically skilled at the inside game. She's always been bad at the outside game. She's never been an effective speaker. She almost skipped the first debate in her first race for Congress because her campaign manager thought she would not do well in a debate. She continues. She's gotten better, but you'd still not say she's an orator, an inspirational orator. That's just not what she's good at. And I think that has been one reason she hasn't gotten all the credit she's due. And it's probably one reason why she's never really been speculated about as a presidential candidate, because I think that if anyone else had been Speaker of the House, as she has been, with the kind of record that she's amassed, you'd think they might run for president. She says herself she's not interested in running for president, and that may well be, has never been interested in running for president. And that may well be true because she is so perfectly designed for the House of Representatives.
So she is, I guess, not comfortable always when you see her on television. You interviewed her several times for your book. Was she comfortable and cooperative in those interviews?
Yes, and I'm so grateful. She gave me, in the end, 10 interviews, which is a lot for somebody who's also the speaker.
Pretty busy.
I did the first. I didn't have any commitment from her on interviews, and when I did the first interview, she presented me, and with one for herself, a Dove bar, an ice cream bar, and I took a bite into it, and I scattered little shards of chocolate all over her carpet, her pristine, light, cream-colored carpet. And so there we are, picking up little shards of chocolate off the floor. And I thought, this woman is never going to let me come back. And, she did let me come back, 9 more interviews, but she never again served any food.
She knew not to trust you with the Dove bar, right?
I guess.
But she seemed to open, from again, reading the book, she seemed to open up the more you went, particularly when you showed her things that you had discovered that she might not even have known about.
Yes, she did. As you would hope, the more I talked to her, the more she trusted me. And she hadn't been aware of the stuff that Jack Murtha wrote. I brought her copies of those notes. I brought her, one of my sons found, I mentioned that her mother was an entrepreneur. Her mother had designed and patented a machine to give women facials, which she sold. And which my son found one on eBay and bought it for me, and it still worked. And it's got a little plaque on it that says,
wow,
that it's a vapor for beauty by Nancy D'Alessandro. So I showed her that. I don't know if she'd ever seen that before. So all that helped. My most recent interview with her was last week, not for the book, but for USA Today. And in it, this is a sign, I think, of how much more comfortable she became in talking to me. I said, if the mob on January 6th had caught you, do you think they would have killed you? Which is a hard question to ask.
Yeah.
And she said, yes, that's what they were setting out to do. And then she said, but they would have had a battle on their hands because I'm a street fighter. And then she lifted up her foot and said, besides, I would have had this as a weapon. And she pointed to her stiletto heels.
Bill Press with journalist and author Susan Page. If you'd like to hear the entire episode, visit BillPressPods.com. And that's all for the America's Democrats podcast. Thank you to all who made today's show possible. Jenny Price, Wallace Mazon, and the entire Bill Press team. And thank you for listening. If you liked what you heard, please get involved in our efforts to keep this show going and to elect Democrats who are bringing the party back to its roots. Go to americasdemocrats.org and click on Donate at the top of the page. And be sure to find 21st Century Democrats on Facebook and Twitter, and leave us a review on your favorite podcast app. For the America's Democrats podcast, I'm your host, Jim Cuddy. We want you to sit back and listen, but we need you to stand up and fight. Join us. Support the AmericasDemocrats.org podcast, a project of 21st Century Democrats, and help elect Democrats who will stand up for democratic principles with your contribution today. Go to AmericasDemocrats.org and click on Donate at the top of the page.